The winter of 1888 came down on the Dakota Territories like a hammer. It was not a gentle descent into slumber, not a soft blanket of white laid over the prairie. It was an occupation. The cold did not knock before it entered. It broke down the door. It was a thief that stole the breath from your lungs and the feeling from your fingers. It was a presence that sat with you at the dinner table, a constant, unwelcome guest whose silence was more menacing than any roar. The wind that carried it was a blade, sharp and relentless, honing itself on the vast, unforgiving flatness of the land. It scoured the plains, peeling away warmth, hope, and the thin veneer of civilization the settlers had tried to impose upon it. In the small, hopeful settlement of Graywood, the fight against this cold was the only true religion. Life was measured in cords of wood, in the thickness of frost on a window pane, in the precious, fleeting moments of warmth stolen from a greedy cast-iron stove. The cabins of Graywood were built as they had always been built, according to a wisdom passed down from men who had come before, men who had also fought the cold and, more often than not, had lost. They were sturdy structures of hewn logs, chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and animal hair. They were monuments to tradition, built with pride and the sweat of honest labor. And they were all failing. The cold found its way through the tightest packed chinking, seeping through the logs themselves like a ghost. It poured down the chimneys the moment a fire died down. Frost didn't just form on the windows. It painted ghostly ferns on the interior walls, a beautiful and deadly art. Families huddled together under piles of blankets and buffalo hides, feeding their stoves a constant diet of cottonwood and oak, watching the heat get devoured by the insatiable hunger of the winter. The sound of an axe splitting wood was the town's heartbeat, a frantic, desperate rhythm that never seemed to stop. From dawn until the last light failed, the men were out, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their faces raw, their bodies aching with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. They were fighting a war of attrition, and their fuel, their energy, their very will, was dwindling with every passing day. It was a universal struggle, a shared misery that bound the community together. They saw the same desperation in each other's eyes, heard the same hacking coughs from children kept too cold for too long, and felt the same gnawing anxiety as they watched their woodpiles shrink. The problem was not one of incompetence. Silas Blackwood, the town's most respected builder, had constructed his own home with a craftsman's precision. Every joint was a work of art, every log perfectly seated. And yet, even in his cabin, the cold had found a home. He spent his nights pacing, adding another log to the fire, feeling the drafts that snaked across the floor like icy serpents, wondering what more a man could possibly do. The old ways were the only ways they knew, and the old ways were not enough. Into this landscape of grim tradition came Ilara Vance. She was a widow, having arrived the previous summer with her two small children, Lena and Tom, and a wagon containing little more than the remnants of a former life. Her husband, Arthur, an engineer with a mind full of books and a heart full of dreams, had succumbed to fever on the journey west. He had left her not with wealth, but with something the settlers of Graywood would have found far stranger: ideas. He had been a student of the old world, of Roman aqueducts and European cathedrals. He studied thermodynamics, the science of heat and its movement, from leather-bound volumes he considered more precious than gold. During their long evenings on the trail, he had not spoken to Ilara of farming or fortune, but of thermal mass, of insulation, and of the physics of shelter. He had taught her to see a house not as a simple barrier against the elements, but as a system for managing energy. The community saw a quiet, fragile woman, ill-suited for the harsh realities of the frontier. They offered her pity and advice in equal measure, assuming she would soon be overwhelmed. When she chose a plot of land at the windswept edge of the settlement to build her home, they shook their heads. When she began to clear the ground, not for a log cabin, but for something else entirely, their pity began to curdle into suspicion. She did not fell the great cottonwoods for logs. Instead, she began hauling fieldstones from the creek bed, piling them methodically. Then she drew a shape in the dirt with a stick. It was a simple rectangle, like any other cabin footprint, but the lines she drew were impossibly far apart. Silas Blackwood, making his rounds to check on the newer families, stopped and watched her. He was a man whose authority was built on the solid foundation of experience. He had built nearly every structure in Greywood, and his word on the subject was law. He squinted at the drawing, then at the growing pile of stones. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble of disapproval, "what sort of foundation is that? It's wide enough for a church." Ilara looked up, her face smudged with dirt, her hands already raw. "The walls will be 3 feet thick," she stated, her voice soft but firm. Silas blinked. He looked around to see if anyone else had heard this absurdity. 3 feet? He repeated, a note of disbelief creeping into his tone. "A log cabin wall is a foot thick, and that's solid wood. What in God's name are you planning to build, a fortress?" "A home," she replied simply, and turned back to her work. The idea was so profoundly alien to the established wisdom of Greywood that it became a source of dark amusement. A 3-foot wall. It defied all logic. It was wasteful. It was foolish. It was, they decided, a woman's fancy, born of grief and ignorance. The men would gather at the small trading post, leaning against the counter as they waited for their supplies. "Heard about the widow's folly?" one would ask, and the laughter would begin. They imagined the sheer volume of wood it would take to heat such a monstrous cavern of stone. "She'll burn through her winter supply by November," another would predict with certainty. "That stone will pull every bit of warmth right out of the air. It'll be colder inside than out." Silas was the most vocal of the critics, not out of malice, but out of a genuine, paternalistic concern that he mistook for wisdom. He saw her folly as a danger to her and her children. He tried to reason with her again. "Ilara," he said, using her first name in an attempt at gentle persuasion. "The cold here is a living thing. It loves stone. Stone is a rock in a frozen river. It just gets colder. You need wood. Wood holds the heat from the fire." She listened patiently, her hands never stopping their work of sorting stones. "Wood holds the heat for a time," she corrected him softly, quoting a line she had read 100 times in Arthur's books. "But stone holds it longer. It keeps it and gives it back slowly. It's called thermal mass." Silas had never heard the term. It sounded like nonsense, like something from a book that had no place in the real world of dirt, sweat, and freezing wind. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of dismissal. "That's book talk. I'm talking about survival. You're building a tomb for your family." The words hung in the air, cruel and heavy. Ilara's eyes hardened for just a moment. "I am building a shelter," she said. "You build yours, Mr. Blackwood. I will build mine." After that, no one offered advice. They just watched, and waited for the inevitable, tragic failure. So began Ilara's long, solitary work. While the rest of Greywood prepared for winter in the familiar, frantic rhythm of their lives, she moved at a different pace, methodical and unyielding. Her days were a litany of back-breaking labor. She rose before the sun, the air so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass. She would go to the creek, using a heavy iron bar to pry stones from the frozen earth, her muscles screaming in protest. She loaded them onto a small, crude sled she had fashioned and dragged them, one load at a time, back to her home site. Her children, Lena and Tom, were her only helpers. They were too small for the heavy lifting, but they gathered what they could. They spent hours combing the frozen prairie for dried grasses and scouring the sparse woods for moss, stuffing it all into burlap sacks. They knew their mother was building them a house, and their faith in her was absolute, a shield against the whispers and stares of the other town children. The foundation was the first great labor, a trench dug deep into the unyielding soil, below the frost line Arthur had told her was so critical. She filled it with the largest stones, fitting them together like a vast, complex puzzle. Then came the walls. Her design was a simple but brilliant innovation born from Arthur's books. She was building two parallel walls, one of stone on the outside and a thinner one of rough-hewn timber on the inside. The space between them, a gap of nearly 2 feet, was the secret. As the walls rose, inch by painstaking inch, she packed this cavity with the materials her children had gathered. A dense, layered mixture of dry moss, prairie grass, and packed earth. It was a colossal, tedious task. Every stone had to be lifted, every board sawn by hand, every bucket of insulation packed down tightly. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and scarred. Her body ached with a fatigue so deep it felt as if it had settled in her bones. But she did not stop. In stark contrast, the rest of Greywood buzzed with the efficient, familiar work of winter preparations. Another family, the Millers, had arrived late in the season, and the community came together for a traditional cabin raising. Under Silas's expert direction, the log walls went up in a single day. The sounds of laughter, of shared labor, of confident, booming voices drifted across the prairie to where Elara worked alone. They notched the logs with practiced skill, slathering the gaps with their standard chinking. By the end of the week, the Millers had a roof over their heads and a fire in their hearth. They looked over at Elara's project, her walls barely waist-high, a strange, thick ruin on the prairie, and they shook their heads with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. They were safe. They were warm. They had followed the proven path. The strange widow, with her foolish ideas and her slow, lonely work, was clearly courting disaster. As autumn bled into the first hard freezes of winter, the details of Elara's innovation became clearer, and with them, the community's derision grew. She wasn't just building thick walls. Everything she did was wrong, according to their wisdom. Her windows were tiny, no bigger than a bread box, and set deep within the massive walls, creating a tunnel-like effect. "Can't enjoy the view from a prison cell," one neighbor joked. Her fireplace was not the grand, open hearth so common in their cabins, a symbol of warmth and hospitality. Instead, she was installing a small, squat iron stove, and the flue she constructed was not a straight shot to the sky. It snaked back and forth through a mass of stone and clay before exiting through the roof. "She's trying to choke herself with smoke," Silas declared to anyone who would listen. "A fire needs to breathe. That thing will never draw." Every element of her design was a quiet rebellion against convention. The thick, insulated walls were meant to create a barrier the cold could not easily breach. The small windows were designed to minimize heat loss, the largest source of cold in any cabin. The deep-set design would trap a pocket of still air, another layer of insulation. The winding flue was a heat exchanger. It was designed to extract every last bit of warmth from the smoke before it escaped, transferring that energy into the stone mass of the chimney, which would then radiate it back into the room for hours. The deep stone foundation was not just for stability. It was to prevent the frozen ground itself from leaching the warmth out of the floor. Each decision was a precise calculation, a piece of a carefully considered system. But to the eyes of Greywood, it was just a collection of mistakes, the clumsy work of a woman who didn't know any better. They saw weakness and folly. They could not see the science. The first snows fell in late October, thin and fleeting. By mid-November, the ground was covered in a permanent blanket of white. The cold began its relentless siege, and then, in the second week of December, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple color to the northwest. The wind died down to an unnerving stillness. The animals fell silent. An old trapper, passing through the settlement, took one look at the horizon and hurried on his way, muttering 2 words to Silas as he passed. White Death. It was a name for a particular kind of prairie blizzard, a storm that was not just snow and wind, but a catastrophic drop in temperature that could freeze a man solid in minutes. It was a killer of livestock, a destroyer of homes, a storm that came to scour the land clean. It arrived in the dead of night. The silence was broken by a low moan that grew into a deafening, shrieking roar. The wind hit the settlement like a physical blow, a solid wall of force and ice. The temperature plummeted, dropping 30, then 40, then 50 degrees in a matter of hours. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, stinging torrent of white that erased the world. It was a storm beyond memory, beyond anything the settlers had prepared for. It was the ultimate test, the final, unforgiving judge of their skill, their wisdom, and their walls. Inside the traditional cabins of Greywood, the world devolved into a nightmare. The wind, like 1,000 sharp knives, found every tiny crack and crevice. It screamed through the chinking, blew freezing soot back down the chimneys, and rattled the wooden shutters as if trying to tear them from their hinges. The cold was no longer a creeping presence. It was a violent invader. The log walls, which had seemed so solid, were now conduits of frost. Water buckets froze solid just a few feet from the roaring fires. The heat from the stoves was stolen the instant it was created, sucked away by the maelstrom outside. Families abandoned their beds and huddled together on the floor, as close to their fires as they dared, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The sound of the wind was a constant, terrifying assault on the senses, a sound of pure, malevolent power. The men worked like stokers in the belly of a failing ship, constantly feeding wood into the hungry stoves. They watched their precious, hard-won wood piles vanish at an impossible rate. In Silas Blackwood's meticulously built home, the failure was the most profound. His pride and joy, the symbol of his mastery, was turning into an icebox. A fine powder of snow was being driven right through the walls, dusting the floor and furniture. His wife was trying to soothe their youngest child, whose coughs were ragged and weak. Silas stared at the last of his firewood, a pitifully small pile, and a cold dread, far deeper than the chill in the air, settled in his heart. He had been so sure. He had been so proud. He was wrong. Across the settlement, at the edge of the world, stood Elara's Folly. From the outside, it was almost completely buried, a low, white mound against the raging blizzard. The wind, unable to find purchase on its low profile and thick walls, flowed over and around it with a frustrated howl. But inside, there was a profound and shocking stillness. The roar of the storm was a distant, muffled whisper, like the sound of a faraway sea. There were no drafts. The air was calm. The small iron stove glowed with a steady, gentle heat, consuming a single, small log every hour. The thick stone and earth walls, having absorbed the stove's warmth all day, were now slowly, steadily radiating it back into the small living space. The interior walls were warm to the touch. The floor, protected by the deep foundation, was cool but not frozen. Lena and Tom slept peacefully in their small bed, tucked under a single quilt, their breathing even and untroubled. Elara sat in a simple wooden chair, mending a tear in Tom's trousers by the light of an oil lamp. The flame burned straight and tall, not flickering once. She had used less wood in a day than her neighbors were burning in an hour. Her home was not a fortress fighting a war with the cold. It was an island of calm in the heart of the storm, a sanctuary built not of arrogance, but of understanding. The test had come. Her creation had endured. The storm raged for 2 days and 3 nights. For the people of Greywood, it was an eternity of cold, fear, and dwindling hope. The miller's new cabin, built so quickly and proudly, had a section of its roof collapse under the weight of the snow. They were forced to take refuge with a neighbor, their own hopes buried under ice and timber. Throughout the settlement, families were reaching the end of their resources. The wood was almost gone. The food was running low. The cold was winning. In Silas's cabin, the temperature had dropped below freezing. His daughter's fever was worsening, and he knew, with the terrible certainty of a man facing his own failure, that she would not survive another night in this cold. His pride, his reputation, his lifetime of supposed wisdom, it had all crumbled to dust in the face of the White Death. There was only one hope, a thought so humbling it felt like a betrayal of his entire life. The widow's folly, the stone tomb. He had mocked it, condemned it, predicted its failure. But what if his predictions, like his cabin, had been hollow? Desperation was a powerful motivator. It could shatter pride like brittle ice. Wrapping himself in every layer he owned, he told his wife, "I'm going to the widow's house. Bar the door behind me." The journey of 100 yards was a life-threatening odyssey. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the air from his lungs. The snow was so deep and the visibility so poor that he had to navigate by memory, a blind man struggling through a hurricane. He fell a dozen times, his body numb, his mind screaming at him to turn back. But the image of his sick child pushed him forward. He finally stumbled into the buried shape of Ilara's home, and finding the door, began to beat on it with his frozen fists, his shouts swallowed by the storm. The door swung inward, and the first thing that struck him was not a sight or a sound, but a feeling. A wave of calm, even, and unbelievable warmth washed over him. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from the very air, from the walls themselves. He stumbled inside, blinking, his eyes adjusting to the soft lamplight. He saw the 2 children asleep, breathing peacefully. He saw Ilara rising from her chair, her expression one of calm concern, not surprise. And he saw the small stove, burning with a quiet, efficient flame. There was no frantic activity, no huddling under blankets, no fear. There was only peace. The contrast between this sanctuary and the frozen hell of his own home was so stark, so absolute, that it broke him. He stood there, a giant of a man, the pillar of the community, covered in snow and shaking uncontrollably, his pride utterly shattered. Ilara did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. She did not demand an apology for the months of mockery and dismissal. Her triumph was not in his defeat, but in the simple, undeniable fact of the warmth that filled her home. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the frost on his beard, the raw defeat in his posture. Her response was one of simple, human decency. "Come in, Silas," she said, her voice gentle. "You are freezing." She helped him out of his snow-caked coat and sat him in the chair she had just vacated, the one closest to the stove. She handed him a tin mug filled with hot broth. He drank it greedily, the warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he thought he might never experience again. He looked around the small room, at the smooth interior walls, at the deeply recessed windows, at the warm stones of the chimney, and he finally understood. He had been building against the winter. She had been building with an understanding of it. Her quiet triumph was in her humility, her patience, and the irrefutable evidence that surrounded him. It worked. He was wrong. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, it revealed a world transformed, buried and silent under a crushing weight of white. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the air was so cold it cracked. Silas, after spending the night in the impossible warmth of Ilara's home, had gone back at first light. With Ilara's help, he had moved his wife and children through the deep snow to the small, sturdy house. His daughter, wrapped in warm blankets and breathing the still, warm air, had finally fallen into a healing sleep. They were not the only ones. News of the warm house, carried by Silas himself, spread through the desperate community like a rumor of gold. Soon, another family appeared at the door, their own fuel supply completely exhausted. Then another, the Millers, whose temporary shelter was also failing. Within hours, Ilara's small home had become a refuge, a crowded but life-saving ark in a frozen sea. 3 families, including the town's master builder, were now huddled in the very structure they had all scorned. They sat in stunned silence, feeling the gentle, radiant heat from the walls, watching Ilara calmly add a single, small log to the stove. The laughter was gone. The mockery had died. In its place was a profound and humbling awe. They looked at this quiet woman, whom they had dismissed as a foolish outsider, and saw a savior. Silas watched her more closely than anyone. He was a craftsman, and his mind, now stripped of its arrogant certainty, began to see the genius in the design. He ran his hand over the interior wall, feeling the absence of frost, the gentle warmth. He watched the way the smoke from the lamp rose straight to the ceiling, evidence of a draft-free home. He saw the logic in the small windows, the purpose in the winding flue, the wisdom in the massive, heat-storing walls. All the things he had dismissed as mistakes, he now saw as brilliant, calculated solutions. His entire understanding of his craft, a craft he had practiced for 30 years, had been rendered obsolete in a single storm. He waited until the children were asleep and the other families had settled into a quiet, exhausted stupor. He approached Ilara as she sat by the stove, her hands busy once again with her mending. He stood before her, not as a figure of authority, but as a supplicant. He swallowed what was left of his pride, a bitter pill. "Ilara," he began, his voice rough with emotion, I was wrong. I was a fool, a proud, blind fool." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She did not offer absolution. She simply waited. "This house," he continued, gesturing to the room around them, "it is the only thing in this town that truly works. I spent my life learning how to build, and I realize now I know nothing." He paused, the confession hanging in the warm, still air. Then he asked the 3 words that would change the future of Greywood forever. "Teach me how." And so, in the heart of the frozen winter, in the crowded sanctuary of the house they had called a folly, the lessons began. Ilara did not hoard her knowledge. She shared it as freely as she had shared her warmth. She retrieved Arthur's worn, leather-bound books, their pages filled with diagrams and equations. She unrolled his hand-drawn schematics on the small wooden table. With a piece of charcoal, she drew on a spare plank of wood, explaining the principles that had been her guide. She spoke of thermal mass, showing Silas how the dense stone walls acted like a battery for heat, absorbing it slowly and releasing it slowly, creating an even, stable temperature. She explained the concept of dead airspace as the greatest insulator, pointing to the gap in her walls and the design of her deep-set windows. She showed him the calculations for the flue, explaining how the increased surface area allowed the stone to capture the escaping heat from the smoke. She explained why the foundation had to go below the frost line, to decouple the house from the frozen earth that acted like a massive heat sink. Silas, the master builder, became the humble student. He listened with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. He asked questions, not to challenge, but to understand. He traced the diagrams with a calloused finger, his mind racing to connect these abstract principles to the physical reality of stone, wood, and mortar. The other men in the room leaned in, listening, their own faces a mixture of shame and dawning comprehension. They were learning a new language, the language of physics and thermodynamics, taught by a quiet widow in the middle of a frozen wasteland. The knowledge was a gift, offered without pride or price, and they received it with the desperate gratitude of survivors. When spring finally came, melting the great mountains of snow and revealing a landscape scrubbed clean and new, a different kind of building began in Greywood. The sound of the axe was still present, but it was joined by the rhythmic clinking of hammer on stone and the grating sound of saws cutting timbers. No one was building the old way. The half-finished cabins were torn down. The plans for new ones were redrawn. Under Ilara's quiet direction and Silas's newly zealous leadership, the entire settlement began to rebuild. They dug deep foundations. They hauled fieldstone from the creek. They raised walls that were thick and solid, with an inner and outer layer, just as she had done. Silas became the most ardent convert, a true apostle of the new method. He worked with the energy of a man redeemed, meticulously overseeing every detail, explaining the why behind every step to the other men. "The heat needs a place to live," he would say, patting a newly laid stone wall. "We're not just keeping the cold out, we're inviting the warmth to stay." The landscape of the settlement physically changed. The flimsy, drafty log cabins were replaced, one by one, with low, sturdy structures that hugged the earth. They looked more like the land itself, solid and enduring. What had once been Ilara's folly was now universally known as the Greywood method, a name spoken with reverence and respect. The story of the town that survived the White Death began to travel. A surveyor, mapping the territory, stopped in Greywood the following autumn and was astonished by the unique and robust construction of the homes. He spent a week there, taking meticulous notes and drawing sketches of Ilara's design. He had seen dozens of frontier towns, many of which had been decimated by the brutal winters. He had never seen anything like this. His report, filed with the territorial government, spoke of a revolutionary building technique that could save countless lives. Travelers who passed through Greywood carried the tale with them to other settlements, describing the house with 3-foot-thick walls that stayed warm with a handful of wood during the worst blizzard in memory. The idea, born from old books and a widow's quiet determination, began to spread. It was not a loud or famous revolution, but a quiet, grassroots movement of common sense and survival. In small, vulnerable settlements across the northern plains, people started building differently. They started digging deeper and building thicker, sharing the principles that had saved one small town. The Greywood method became a part of the unwritten wisdom of the frontier, a legacy of stone and warmth. Years passed. Greywood thrived. The winters still came, fierce and unforgiving, but they were no longer a terror. The sound of the wind howling outside was just that, a sound. It no longer held the power to steal life and hope. Ilara Vance never sought credit or praise. She lived quietly in her small, warm home, raising her children and watching the town grow strong around her. Silas Blackwood became her lifelong friend, a man whose respect for her was boundless. He always said that the White Death of 1888 had been the coldest winter of his life, but it was also the winter he had learned the most important lesson. The story of Greywood became a quiet legend, a testament to the fact that the most entrenched traditions can be broken by a single, better idea. It served as a powerful reminder that wisdom does not always come from the loudest voice or the most respected authority. Sometimes it comes from a quiet outsider who has the courage to listen to a different kind of knowledge. It is a story about the triumph of humility over pride, of observation over assumption, and of the profound strength that can be found not in fighting the world, but in understanding how it works. The greatest walls are not always built to keep things out, but to hold precious things in. And the warmest shelter is often the one built with a foundation of humility, open to the simple, undeniable truth of what works.